Hi, everyone. Welcome to Haaretz Live. We are joined by our readers from all over the world, which is very exciting, just to see the numbers. I hope everyone is safe and watching us from home. And with me today, from his home, is Amos Harel, who is our Senior Security and Defense Analyst. These days also covering the coronavirus crisis. You will share with us, Amos, soon some thoughts about this career shift. And we also have Amir Tibon on the line. Amir is a Haaretz correspondent in Washington, D.C., joining us from his home there. Hi, Amir.
Hello.
And congratulations. You just had a baby girl. So if she wakes up, maybe the audience will get a chance to see her. Just a heads up, everybody, in case a very young panelists join us. So before we dive deep into politics, geopolitics, and viruses, there's a new government in Israel this week, finally, after no less than 3 rounds of elections. It's Netanyahu's 5th government. But this time, for the first time, we also have an alternate prime minister. I know it sounds weird, but that's the situation. Netanyahu's once rival, former IDF chief Benny Gantz. So Amos and Amir, how long you both predict this will last? What are the chances and main challenges? Amos?
Look, first of all, hello everybody. I think this government was established for one reason and one reason only, and this is the political survival of Benjamin Netanyahu. This is the main reason. It was presented otherwise 2 months ago when Netanyahu began negotiations with Blue and White after the 3rd round of elections. At the time, it seemed as if we were facing an unprecedented crisis, the coronavirus crisis, of course, and the government was described as a sort of an emergency government to deal with the crisis. 2.5 months later, we're all wiser, and we can all realize that more than anything else, this government is meant to maintain Netanyahu's political survival. A coronavirus miracle happened to Netanyahu. It helped him both to delay his trial by 2 months and establish a government in which he has the upper hand. He's, of course, a much better political player than Ashkenazi and Gantz, who are relatively new to this game. And I think that the government will survive as long as it's useful for Netanyahu's intentions. If in 18 months' time, he sees that he has other options and that he can do without his political partners, I'm pretty sure that Netanyahu would find an excuse to desert his promises to his new partners. I would assume that his supporters would justify that. And therefore, I'm doubtful whether Benny Gantz at one point or another would change this title of alternate prime minister and become a real prime minister.
Amir, what do you think? Is there a chance for this kind of weird government?
Well, I think Amos summarized it extremely well. This is not a government that seems to actually represent some kind of a real political compromise. We call it a unity government in our reporting. And technically you can call it that way because you do have the Likud and all the right-wing religious parties that align with Netanyahu joining forces with, I would say, a party and a half from the other side, right? A unity government in Israel is when you bring the right wing and the center left together. And technically you do have a center left representation in the government. You have the kind of the fraction of Gantz's party that split from the Blue and White alliance. And then you have the last remnants of the Labour Party, I think 2 members of Knesset who are both going to be ministers in the government, joining forces. But the truth is that the religious right wing has a huge advantage in this government. They are the overwhelming majority of the members of Knesset who make this coalition. Netanyahu, like Amos said, remains in office, remains powerful, and still has the ability to use the powers of the state to advance his own interests and to continue his war against the legal authorities in Israel. These are the headlines today we're seeing in Israel, that he's trying to delay his appearance in his trial, which is supposed to begin next week. And we're probably going to see more and more attacks on the legal system. And that's why I agree with Moses' analysis that this is not really an actual fair and a balanced power sharing agreement. But perhaps it does serve also the immediate interests of Benny Gantz, who was just tired and exhausted after 3 elections. And I think Noah and Amos, we can understand him because we're also tired from these 3 elections. And it's just exhausting to go through this again and again. And I think for many journalists in Israel, the prospect of a 4th election was a real nightmare. And if that's how we look at it, just imagine what it is for Benny Gantz after a 1.5 years of campaigning and really being the target of probably the most negative and most dirty campaign in the history of Israeli politics, which is a hard thing to do. And he was just exhausted and tired, and he agreed to compromise and got some scraps that he can perhaps present as achievements, but not a real victory, at least in my view.
Just to follow up on that, the person who wants to be a prime minister was too exhausted to campaign, you're saying?
It is what it is. Yeah, I think that's part of the problem, and you need to want it. And this is something we also always say about Netanyahu, right? That at the end of the day, he really wants it. He wants to keep the job. And perhaps Gantz did not want it as much. But you know what? If in a 1.5 years a miracle happens, right? Amos said that Netanyahu just had a miracle. If in a 1.5 years a miracle happens to Gantz and somehow Netanyahu respects the power sharing agreement and allows him to become prime minister, we will all speak very differently. So only time will tell if this is a complete capitulation from Gantz or maybe there is some stroke of genius to it. And I think Amos, you will agree, if there is one thing that has characterized Gantz's career as a military officer, he's a very lucky guy. He's had a lot of luck in several stations in his career, so let's wait and see.
And of course, you remember that Napoleon expected his generals to be lucky. Gantz surprised everybody time after time by reaching mountaintops that nobody expected him to actually reach. And this is what happened to him. Right now, he seems to be not yet ready for prime time. And it was quite clear for everybody, for all 3 of us who were following him for some years, or sometimes in my case, decades, that he never really wanted this, as Amir has said. He was pushed into this because of the expectations of the center-left and because people saw him as the anti-Bibi, the guy who could finally defeat this huge political entity, this character, or this myth of Netanyahu. When he failed for the 3rd time, he didn't really fail. It was another miserable draw. He found the easiest way out for him. And I think he's quite satisfied with that. You can see him even now, as we speak, he's being interviewed on Channel 12 for the first time after a few weeks. And it's quite clear that he didn't really want this this time. He didn't want to be a prime minister immediately, especially during the Corona crisis.
So Amos, if you have to predict, do you think in a 1.5 years we'll see Gantz as a prime minister or not?
I would gamble that Netanyahu somehow remains prime minister. If not, the only alternative I can see is that for some reason or other, Netanyahu decides that the better option, the better alternative for him to avoid trial and to avoid jail time is to become our president, where he can be safe for the next 7 years. And if that is the case, then maybe Gantz would be allowed to become prime minister. And even then, I wouldn't count Gabi Ashkenazi out. Ashkenazi, of course, is the #2 in the new form of the new version of Blue and White. Is the new foreign minister. He's your job now. But I think that I wouldn't bet on Ashkenazi and Gantz remaining political allies forever. I think that at one point or another, Gantz may find himself stabbed in the back.
Very interesting. So you can all write down the name Ashkenazi as well. Amos, as I mentioned in the beginning, you now cover, in addition to your regular defense portfolio, the Corona crisis in Israel since it began. Are there any similarities between covering a war and a war against the virus? And is Israel really winning this war, as it seems?
There are some similarities. I'll make a long story short. At the first week of the crisis in Israel, I think it was early March, Aluf Ben, our editor-in-chief, called me and said, okay, you have a new job now. I asked, well, what is it? And he said, well, look, a disease such as this one, a pandemic, is actually a national security crisis. A pandemic is very close to wars. Wars, you know, you've covered quite a few of them. Deal with it. And this is what I've tried to do since. I think there are some similarities. I think that the First of all, this is very, very intensive, as you know. We've been through, I don't know, 14, 15, 16 hours a day of work regarding the crisis for quite some time. It was very, very intense. It was also quite frightening. President Trump calls it the invisible enemy. It's a different enemy, and it's hard in the beginning to. We've seen scientists, we've seen doctors, we've seen ministers and prime ministers struggling with this concept. It was hard to realize what was going on in the beginning. By now, I think I understand more of it, and I think there are similarities because of some of these crises are quite the same type of urgency, and the way things are, as I said, are so intense. Regarding our position against the virus, our battle against the virus, I think we're doing rather well. We just had the daily statistics. There are 12 new identified cases of Israelis who are ill with coronavirus since for the last 24 hours. 12 in a nation of 9 million people. It's not a lot. There are only, I think, less than 3,000 active cases. So if the current rate continues, within 2 or 3 weeks, we may remain with a few hundred cases. This is not the end of the world. Israel can deal with that. We're gradually opening up. There were some good decisions that were taken here in the beginning. I think we were better off than the United States. I think Netanyahu was much quicker than his friend, President Trump, in realizing where this was heading and what was needed to be done immediately, late February, early March. And I think we've been successful at that. And right now, I think what's working to our benefit more than anything else is the heat. We've been through a terrible heat wave in the Middle East. It's quite troubling for everybody, but on the other hand, apparently it's helping stop the virus from marching on. And this is the main reason for the low numbers. Hopefully, we can go through the summer and remain rather safe. The big question for everybody is what happens come October. Do we see a new wave of the pandemic? Is it in any way connected to the seasonal flu, and how Israel would deal with that at that time? Hopefully, we'll be more prepared than we were 2 or 3 months ago.
So would you say it's more the policies or the heat?
Look, it's a combination of everything, and we don't know yet. The most interesting thing to me is that I keep talking to doctors and professors and scientists and so on, and the people who actually are supposed to know this profession, to know about pandemics, actually tell you time after time, we just don't know yet. We don't have enough information. This is a new phenomena. Give us some more time. The heat is very, very important. But as I said in the beginning, and Netanyahu has said that repeatedly, and he was quite right about that, you need to take the decisions very, very quickly. And this is what Israel did late February, early March. The decision to close Ben Gurion Airport to tourists, the decision to make all Israelis who came here back to Israel self-quarantine for 2 weeks. The decision to begin with testing quite quickly when you compare the situation here with the situation with the States. So that was lucky for us. That these were smart moves taken by Netanyahu. On top of that, the population here is quite young. Not too many old people. Old people stayed at home since early March and remained safe, most of them. And when you combine everything else that I've mentioned with this terrible heat that we've been through in the last few days, I think all of this is helpful. And all of this puts us in a rather, I'd say, we're doing pretty well against the virus for the time being.
You mentioned, you compared the situation to the United States and specifically how President Trump reacted to the virus, at least in the beginning, although we saw yesterday also
not just the
interesting
beginning.
remark. It's interesting to mention also that Netanyahu was quite reluctant in the beginning to act and forbid the flights from the US early on. And we just saw some data on how I think 70% of the cases in Israel came from the United States. Was that a mistake?
I think that's a very good point you made. Yeah, there was news research by the Tel Aviv University that was published, I think, 2 days ago. And as you said, 70% of the cases that were identified, all cases, of course, naturally came from abroad, but 70% came from the United States. And there were two reasons for the fact that Netanyahu was reluctant to stop flights from the States. One was his relationship with Trump. He didn't want to offend the president. The second, which was at least as important, is his relationship with the ultra-Orthodox parties. Because members of the Haredi community, especially in Brooklyn, in New York City at large, but especially in Brooklyn, many of these people were had already fallen ill. They felt that Israel was a better place to treat their illness than the United States. And they came here, and both Netanyahu and the health minister at that time, Litzman, Yaakov Litzman, who is a member of one of the two Haredi, ultra-Orthodox parties, actually helped those people come here and really did not take good care of the situation. And the end result of that was that hundreds of people sick with corona came to Israel, did not necessarily self-quarantine, and actually helped spread the virus, at least in the beginning. When you look at the situation in the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods in Bnei Brak, or in Bnei Brak is an ultra-Orthodox city, but the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods in Jerusalem, the main explanation for the fact that so many Haredi people were inflicted with the virus is exactly that. It came from the US, and it came through people coming while they were already ill or beginning to show symptoms of the virus. This is very, very troubling. This is something that we need to solve come next winter.
Amir, you've been following as well the American reaction to the virus. How was it different from Israel's in your view? And why did it affect so harshly some of the Jewish communities, ultra-Orthodox communities in the US as well?
Yeah, being an Israeli reporter right now in Washington, D.C., it's been kind of a crazy perspective, specifically with the coronavirus, because I live here and I live through what is happening with this administration, how it's been handling the crisis. Some would say mishandling the crisis, at least in the beginning. And at the same time, watching the headlines from Israel and following every day at what is happening back home. And the difference that Amos described, the early reaction in Israel in late February, early March, versus the total American, I would say, reluctance to even admit that there is a problem, right? At the same time that Israel was already discussing closing borders and Netanyahu was talking about the importance of washing hands and things like that, Trump goes out and says, oh, this will disappear in the spring. We'll have 15 people and it will go down to 0 and there will be nothing. And it was a bit of a dual reality to live through, because being impacted, as a journalist, you're also a consumer of news. So being impacted by consuming the news in Israel, I was very scared about the coronavirus already in late February. And I remember my wife and I actually talking before the AIPAC conference in early March about whether or not I should actually go to the conference or maybe cover it through watching video from home. Eventually, I went to the conference, but I only went for very specific time windows, whereas in previous years when there is AIPAC, for me, I spend entire days over there in the conference center. But this year, because we were impacted by the situation in Israel and the headlines about it, and I want to remind our viewers, this was happening while Israel was on the verge of an election. We had an election on March 2nd, and if you were following the headlines in Israel in the 2 weeks before the election, it was all about coronavirus. You barely had political issues. A lot of times started in the news programs on television as the 4th or 5th item of the day. Corona was really dominating the conversation. Here in the US and specifically in Washington, there was nothing about it. It was discussed as a problem that is happening in other countries. Trump, as I said, completely disregarding it. And I think AIPAC was a great example. I mean, the idea of bringing together 18,000 different people to the same building, that is, all the windows are closed, everybody spends hours upon hours in the same rooms. It's madness, honestly. But it didn't seem mad to most people at the time. And I think very few people didn't go to AIPAC because of the coronavirus this year. They still had a major participation, people from all over the country and the world, including from Israel, flying in. I remember Noah at the time raising flags about it and saying, what about the people who are at AIPAC? What happens when they come back to Israel? Are they going to be screened? Are they going to be tested? And I think actually an interesting thing that happened is that the AIPAC conference became the moment that the American Jewish community realized that coronavirus is a real problem, because in the days after the conference, this is the 1st and 2nd week of March, AIPAC began to send these emails to all of their mailing list, informing people, oh, we had this one person who had coronavirus and attended the conference, but don't worry, no, everybody's okay. Then the next day, oh, actually there was this delegation from New York that a few people were exposed to a person, but don't worry. And it became, we were having these rolling coverage stories in Haaretz, you know, a person from Ohio who attended AIPAC and then had coronavirus, a person from Los Angeles. And I think this is when many people in the American Jewish community, because AIPAC is such a big thing in the American Jewish community, realized that this is a real problem. And you began to have the discussions about closing down schools and closing down synagogues and maybe not having Purim parties this year. Some synagogues realized that if you do a Purim party, you could regret it 2 weeks later. Where it was much slower, the realization, and unfortunately the results of being disastrous was, as you said, Noah, in the ultra-Orthodox communities, especially in New York and its surroundings. That's where you had most of the real damage caused within the Jewish community. We were following it closely. I remember having conversations with Avi Sharf, the editor of the English edition, who were saying, you know, let's look at different Jewish communities and try to see where we have outbreaks. And eventually what we saw is that it was really kind of, in terms of Jewish outbreaks, mostly limited to New York, mostly limited to the ultra-Orthodox communities, because I think many other Jewish institutions around the country closed much earlier and decided to take the warning that we saw. I think AIPAC was the big warning, and understand that you need to now be very careful and very slow. And that's been the reality up until now. And the last thing I will say about, again, the Israeli perspective, being an Israeli reporter and following this crisis over here, in the beginning, it was weird living here, seeing the total apathy and the total just, you know, kind of disregard. And at the same time, watching the headlines in Israel about the panic. Now I'm in the reverse situation. In Israel, the coronavirus is already over, right? As Amos described this, you know, the schools are being opened, people are going to the beach, life is back to normal. Over here, the crisis, especially in the Washington, D.C. area where I live, is still happening. The numbers are still growing. The governor of Virginia and the governor of Maryland and the mayor of Washington, D.C., that's kind of like the area around here, are still warning people to wear masks and not to leave the house. And so I talked to my parents in Israel even, and they, you know, they're talking about going back to normal, whereas over here, we still don't leave the house unless it's for something that is very essential.
So we'll maybe go back to the coronavirus crisis later on. I see that there are some questions about that. But meanwhile, Amir, the formation of a new Israeli government is renewing the international attention to President Trump's peace deal, if someone already forgot, and especially the settlements annexation plan, which even with his new partners, Netanyahu is still promising to fulfill. Gantz and the new foreign minister Ashkenazi, which we mentioned before, also a former general from Kachol Lavan, both said yesterday, Gantz and Ashkenazi, that they support Trump's plan, but with everything that's in it, quote, meaning not only annexation, but negotiating a Palestinian state. Meanwhile, Secretary Pompeo, who just came for a very brief visit in Israel, keeps emphasizing all the time that annexation is Israel's decision. So Amir, is the administration trying to cool this down or actually push this forward?
I think the administration, first of all, doesn't speak in one voice on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and that's been, you know, I don't know if it's a problem or a benefit for us, the journalists, but it's been the situation since the very beginning, right? If we go back to even to the first year of the Trump administration, you had people, you know, now this will seem like very distant memories, but there were still people in the administration like Rex Tillerson, remember, who used to be Secretary of State, James Mattis, the general who used to be the defense secretary, General McMaster, who used to be the national security advisor. They were presenting one line on issues of Israel and the Palestinians and the Middle East. And then you had very combative people like Steve Bannon and David Friedman, the ambassador who's still there, that presented a totally different line. The divergence today is not as extreme as it was in 2017, but it still exists, especially on this issue of annexation. Because if you listen to David Friedman, or even to Pompeo on some days, I think Pompeo's tone has changed a little bit recently, and I'm still trying to understand why. But on some days, Pompeo was still more aligned with Friedman. They talk about annexation as just a fact of life that's going to happen very soon. And Friedman keeps saying, you know, in a few weeks you can do it, almost no conditions attached in a way. It seems sometimes, I know, Noah, you've written it, that Friedman is more than allowing Israel to annex the settlements, he's pushing Israel to do it. But if you listen to Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor, and the person who is most responsible for this deal of the century, he sounds much more cautious, and he's talking about some kind of move that also involves the Arab world, and that needs to be as part of, if not an agreement, at least some negotiation, and it needs to receive some kind of broader legitimacy. And we saw this moment of clash between them before the Israeli election of March, when after the peace plan was presented, Friedman immediately said, okay, Israel can basically annex all the settlements on Sunday. And Kushner went on CNN and said, no, they have to wait until after the election. They need to have a new government. I think behind the scenes, Kushner was also hinting that a unity government is preferable because then this is more of a consensus move. So I'm not sure there is one voice. When you put Gantz and Ashkenazi into the period, they have been saying very clearly that they are fine with some degree of annexation, but it needs to be coordinated with the world. Now, what does it mean, annexation that is coordinated with the world? Because what you've been reporting, Noah, for the last week is all these countries, from Canada to the EU, Jordan, Egypt, you name it, coming out against Israeli annexation. My guess is that when Gantz says annexation in coordination, he's talking about something very limited. He's talking maybe about annexing several settlements, I don't know, in the Gush Etzion area, south of Jerusalem, or some parts of the Jordan Valley, you know, maybe not the entire area, but several settlements, something that maybe the world will denounce, but not in a very strong tone. And something that organizations like AIPAC and like American Jewish Community and others here in America will be able to say, you know what? Those areas were going to be part of Israel anyway in a future peace deal. And they will take out the maps, the Clinton parameters, and the Olmert plan and say, you see, this was already supposed to be part of Israel. So it's not such a big deal, the annexation. I think this is something Benny Gantz and Gabi Ashkenazi can live with and be happy with. Of course, that's not what Netanyahu and David Friedman are talking about. They are talking about basically annexing all the settlements in the West Bank, which is a totally different move. The scale is different. The implications are different. The reaction of the world will probably be different. I don't know how Gantz and Ashkenazi can save face with that kind of policy. And then we have the player that, you know, we don't know where he's going to fall, which is Kushner. Because I think from the point of view of Kushner, this is really about helping Trump's re-election. This is about getting to the summer, or at least the early fall, with another huge achievement that Trump can present to the evangelical voters here in America that care deeply about Israel and they love his Israel policy. And before the midterm elections, they saw the embassy move to Jerusalem, and they saw Trump withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal. And now, before the general election, there needs to be another big move. Does Kushner believe that limited annexation of, let's say, I don't know, 15 settlements that are in areas that would be part of Israel in a future peace deal anyway, does he believe that is enough? Does he believe you can make a big enough celebration of that? Because if he does, maybe the Gantz-Kushner kind of a vision can materialize, and you will have, again, denunciations, but not crazy, angry ones from other countries. Or does Kushner go with the Friedman-Netanyahu version, you know, annex all the settlements, and then we're in a totally different territory? And again, I don't know how Gantz and Ashkenazi save face. How do they explain this to their voters? Because that would be, it will not just be capitulation in terms of accepting Netanyahu as prime minister. This will go against their core beliefs as defense people, because they never spoke about these ideas when they were in the military. They opposed these ideas. They said it would be dangerous. It would harm the peace with Jordan. So that would put them in a terrible position.
Amos, we keep hearing from past and present Israeli generals that annexation is actually bad for Israel's security. Is it?
I have to agree with them. Look, I've been talking constantly, as Amir has mentioned, both Gantz and Ashkenazi were, of course, chiefs of staff of the army. Ashkenazi became chief of staff at 2007 until 2011, and then Gantz replaced him until 2015. I've known them for years. This was always the army's position, and not only the army's professional point of view. I would say that Shin Bet chiefs held the same kind of view, saying that any kind of a unilateral act from Israel's side in the West Bank would mean trouble. It would mean trouble regarding the Palestinians, perhaps even the possibility of the third intifada, some kind of a major revolt, an uprising that would lead us to another massive cycle of violence. And on the other hand, that this could be very, very damaging to our relationship with Jordan. And it may also affect our growing or improving relationship with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. I'm not so sure about Saudi Arabia anymore. It's hard to tell. I'm not so sure even about Netanyahu's plans. Our colleague, Anshel Pfeffer, keeps tweeting in the last few days that there's no possibility whatsoever that Bibi would go all the way, and he believes that this is some kind of a trick that would suddenly disappear. It's hard to tell. Netanyahu has been pushed into a corner because of his situation regarding his trial next week. He is looking for more right-wing support, especially after Yamina, the right-wing Zionist religious party, was left out of the coalition, and he's looking for another PR stunt. And as Samir has mentioned, Trump may follow. We've been saying for years. Remember those times when we said there's no way that the Israeli embassy, that the American embassy would be moved to Jerusalem. There's no way that any kind of American president would get out of the nuclear deal. Both of these things happened. He even recognized Israeli sovereignty in the Golan Heights. So anything could happen. I'd be very concerned mostly about the possibility of an uptick in violence in the West Bank, and also our relationship with Jordan. A story I broke just 2 days ago. We saw this interview that King Abdallah gave to the German weekly, to Der Spiegel, warning about the implications. There were even harsher messages sent to Jerusalem through the channels to Netanyahu, through speaking to people at the defense establishment, and also to Gantz's people in recent days and weeks, saying, look, we're getting into trouble here. This could be very, very dangerous. You should consider a U-turn. Netanyahu did not show any sign that he was listening to these messages. And therefore, I think that even if we get a break from the coronavirus in the next month or so, the possibility of annexation could change the mood here completely, could control the agenda, and it could have some harmful implications for Israel.
So Amos, we mentioned Pompeo's brief visit to Israel, and annexation was part of the conversation, but as Pompeo said, not the main issue, which brings us to 2 other issues that were probably the main issue, China and Iran. First of all, Amos, what's your take on Pompeo's visit? One of our followers is also asking, what was so urgent that he couldn't say on a secure phone?
Look, we don't know exactly yet. We don't have the full details, but my guess would be 2 explanations. I would put it this way. I think he came here, he was invited here to talk about Iran, and he came here to talk about China. I think that Israel was extremely concerned regarding the latest developments with Iran. More about that in a second. The recent reports from Washington about the Israeli cyber attacks in Iran, but I think this was...
let's start with China and then, then we'll move on to
the second issue, of course, is China, and China is getting to be a huge story. You remember we broke the story in the Haaretz, I think it was September 2018. That was the first time that anybody reported about how deeply concerned the administration, the Trump administration, was regarding this growing, developing relationship between Israel and China. Infrastructure projects, more than anything else. It was the Haifa harbor at that time. Amir, I think we shared some bylines on this story as well. Every time an Israeli official went to Washington, Noah, you're familiar with that as well, they came back surprised by how concerned the administration was with this, how dangerous the issue had become, how toxic it had become. And of course, there's a by now, it's probably one of the only bipartisan issues in Washington. Correct me if I'm wrong, Emil. This fear of China and this vision of China as the main competition, as a dangerous competition to the United States. Now, then came, of course, the pandemic. And since President Trump is in so much trouble because of this deep change in the American economy, he needs somebody to shift the blame to. So, of course, the president blames the mainstream media. He blames the Democrats. He blames President Obama, but he also focuses on China. And the way both the president and Secretary Pompeo keep repeating the Wuhan virus, the Chinese virus, and so on in every public appearance, this means that the language by now is toxic. And at this point, Israel has been walking a tightrope between the US and China for quite some time. I think we're facing the end of that rope. And I think that Washington is expecting Jerusalem to decide, whose side are you on? We can no longer sell them the story that we remain your best friends. However, we have all those cheap deals on infrastructure from China. Let us continue with that. This is too dangerous for Israeli security, and more than anything else, it's dangerous to our relationship with Washington. I haven't seen an ultimatum yet, but I think what we'll see in the near future is that the Americans are expecting Israel not to sever ties completely, but to back off all kinds of deals with the Chinese. This is going to be a huge issue in the near future. And if we go back to 2001, 2002, 2003, at that time, there was quite a massive crisis between the Israeli defense establishment and the Pentagon regarding weapons deals between Israel and China that the United States was very, very angry about. And some of you may remember that, but Israeli officials were boycotted by the Americans for quite some time. It was the end of some remarkable careers at the Israeli defense establishment because the Americans said, look, you cheated us on this, you lied to us, you're never going to work in this town, meaning Washington again. I think this can happen again. And Netanyahu, of course, is very, very good at realizing where the wind blows and what direction it blows in Washington. But I think he's only beginning to realize how deep of a challenge this is becoming regarding our relationship with China and how angry Washington is at Israel because of this.
So another issue you just mentioned, not less concerning, is the growing tensions behind the scenes between the US, Israel, and Iran. And today we just saw reports that Israel retaliated allegedly in a cyber attack against Iran. Are we seeing a shift from the Syrian arena towards a cyber war?
I think that both would remain active. What happened recently is that, remember those days before the coronavirus, that was months ago, but remember in January, of course, the United States decided to assassinate General Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, the Iranian IRGC command in Iraq. And at that time, the United States was applying enormous amount of pressure, sanctions, economic sanctions, but also military provocations against Iran in order to push Iran against the wall and to make Iran reach a new deal regarding its nuclear plans, or even there was some discussion of regime change, forcing a regime change in Tehran. The situation has somewhat changed since then. Iran, of course, was hit very, very badly and quite early with the coronavirus, and Israel took advantage of that. As far as we know, there have been dozens of reports of Israeli strikes in Syria, which were quite successful. And one of the problems that the Iranians were facing was that without Soleimani, they had nobody to lead this war, to retaliate against Israel. I think the way they found to react in the end was this reported attacks, an attempt of a cyber attack against Israeli water infrastructure last month, and there was a very swift retaliation, as far as we can tell, at least according to the Washington Post, from Israel, quite a massive and quite successful cyber attack against the Bandar Abbas port harbor at southern Iran. This was only reported this morning. This is going to be a big story. I think we'll see this continued. We'll see both strikes on the ground in Syria and some attempts of more cyber warfare on both sides. It's not the first time. We of course remember the Stuxnet story in the late 2008, 2009, but we'll see more of that. And I think the Israeli message is quite clear. Israel is actually saying to Tehran, you crossed a red line by trying to hit our civilian infrastructure. We can do much more damage. This is a first taste. And if you try anything more than that, the damage that you will suffer would be on a much larger scale than anything you can do to us.
So to all of these different issues, we have another event in the near future which might affect everything we still haven't discussed, which is the American elections. Amira, how will maybe new American president affect all these issues? Let's start maybe specifically with annexation, but also the other issues that we just raised.
Yeah, so I think the two issues where it's easy to see a policy shift if the occupant of the White House changes after November are annexation and Iran. On annexation, it's pretty clear that Biden or frankly any other Democratic president would not give a green light to Israel and certainly would not push Israel to do it, as we are seeing at least from some people in the Trump administration. All of that will come to a complete halt. I don't think, though, that we will also see a significant pressure on Israel to do the opposite, which is to take down settlements and reach an agreement with the Palestinians and all of that. I think that's not very likely, especially if it's Biden. If we were having Bernie Sanders as the Democratic nominee for president, that would be a totally different conversation because Sanders has spoken explicitly about conditioning military aid to Israel and taking some of the aid that Israel receives and actually giving it to Gaza. And ideas that would really create pressure and would bring this to a boiling point. But Biden is not there. We just yesterday heard one of his senior advisors tell a pro-Israeli group here in Washington that he completely opposes even the discussion of conditioning or limiting military aid to Israel. He's called it in the past an outrageous idea that was proposed by Sanders. And he's talking about having disagreements with Israel behind the scenes, keeping it behind closed doors, not having a fight. And I think that people who worked with Biden from the Israeli system when he was Obama's vice president are not surprised to see this, because when he was Obama's vice president, many times he was the person that Obama chose to dispatch to Israel to try to calm down tensions, to try to reach some understandings. Even after the big explosion over the Iran nuclear deal, we're talking now about the year 2016, there was an event where he met Ron Dermer, the Israeli ambassador to Washington, and Netanyahu's right-hand man, and they were hugging and exchanging compliments with each other. So I think from the Israeli point of view, a Biden presidency means no annexation, but also not really any kind of change and not really any kind of pressure to actually see a different reality with the Palestinians, which, by the way, is a bit different than the Trump administration continuing, because Trump could decide that in a second term, he actually wants to get the Nobel Prize and the big peace deal and everything that he didn't get in the first term. So that's the calculation on that front. On the Iranian front, I think this is where there is concern in Israel about a Biden presidency, or again, any Democratic president. And this is something that we've written about extensively in Haaretz. Basically, the Israeli calculation is that the next president, if it's a Democratic president, will try to return to the Iran nuclear deal. And Dermer gave a speech at AIPAC last year where he kind of said that this is a red line for Israel. He said that Israel will not be supportive of any calls to renew the Iran nuclear deal, to go back to the deal that Trump withdrew from in 2018. Why is it important that Dermer kind of came and said this is a red line? Because it means that if this is the stated position of the Democratic presidential nominee ahead of the November election, Israel will, in some degree, be interfering in the election and basically saying, we disagree with that. We agree with the position of President Trump that there should not be a return to the Iran deal. Dermer's comments did leave some space for a potential Democratic nominee to come and say, I want to return to the Iran nuclear deal, but I want to make changes to the deal. I want to update it. I want to improve it. I want to add new clauses and new information and new restrictions on Iran. And if that's the position that a Biden administration would take, basically it's not go back to the Iran deal, it's renegotiate the Iran deal. Maybe that's something that Israel could live with more easily. But still, I think there will be tensions around this issue because the policy will be very different than what we've seen under Trump. Although I will add one caveat, we have seen the Trump administration also over the past 2 years flirting with Iran about potential negotiations. And that never materialized, mostly because of the Iranians, by the way, who were very stubborn. But every time that there were these flirtations between Trump and Iran, I think the highest point was in September of last year around the UN General Assembly, we saw an uptick in concern on the Israeli side. And this is something that all three of us have written about. You could see it from the Prime Minister's office, through the Mossad and the military, and even the embassy over here. People were concerned about this because we know that Trump still insisted all the time that he's willing to negotiate with Iran without any preconditions, that he wants to have a deal with them, that he says they could be great friends. I think before the election, it's very unlikely that we will see any movement of that, because I think right now for Trump, it would not necessarily serve him politically. He needs to secure the evangelical vote. Negotiations with Iran are not going to help with that. But if he gets a second term, you know, all options are on the table. And then the last thing, China. This is where I actually think there will be continuation between a Trump administration and any other American president, because just like Amos said, this is now a bipartisan issue here in Washington. The fear of China, the anger over American allies that have close trade partnerships with China, and the willingness to hurt China economically, that's something that both parties share. And actually the Democrats are attacking Trump on China, you would say from the right, meaning saying he's too soft on China, he's allowing China too much. And this is one issue also that is coming, it's not just a policy that comes from the White House, it's also coming from the professional ranks, this pressure. So a different president on that issue would still be problematic if Israel chooses to continue these deals with China, although I agree with Amos, we're probably going to see a shift in the Israeli policy because when America finally puts down the pressure, Israel usually understands it.
Amos, how do you see the effect of next American elections on the relations with Israel? Maybe you can disagree a little bit, it will spice things up.
That's one of our usual problems. We tend to agree too much, Amir and myself. Look, it's rather clear that Netanyahu is in Trump's corner, and we followed their relationship for quite some time, and we've heard some of the quotes coming out of Netanyahu's circle regarding Trump. Netanyahu said that publicly. He said that he was I think he defined him as the best ever American president from an Israeli point of view, and something that one could argue about even now. Remember just this Trump Heights, this attempt to found a new settlement on the Golan Heights. Of course, nothing happened. It was only a sign, and even I think somebody showed this sign about a few weeks back, and it turned out that
it's gone. It's gone like the town that never existed.
The letters have been fallen down, so it looks like the joke it was a few months back. But other than that, of course, Netanyahu is wishing and praying and hoping for a Trump victory. I'm not sure he's he's frightened by the possibility of a Biden presidency. I think that he would adapt rather quickly, but it was very clear for the last 3 years that Israel, the official Israel, was invested in Trump and only in Trump, not even in the GOP, but just at the president and the president's cronies and so on. And you could see this alienation from anybody who talked to Democrat senators or leaders and so on in recent years. You could see this anger growing against Israel towards Netanyahu and so on for many reasons, but not only the occupation anymore, and not only Iran, but just the fact that he was so tight with Trump, and the fact that he was playing along with the president's different quirks and so on. In my view, I think Trump remains popular in the eyes of many Israelis, but people who follow at least the current America, the way America is handling the pandemic, and who care for America and so on, people in Israel have become quite worried about the way things are going on right now in DC. For years and years, we hoped, we looked up to America, we hoped for American help, assistance, and so on. Look at what happened with the virus. Israel is in a much better position than the United States. And I think we'll see that if there are results to that, if there are any consequences to that in November. But I think many Israelis who used to look up to America are now taking a different perspective, considering the way the United States is dealing with this unprecedented crisis regarding the virus.
I'll just interject to agree with Amos on one point. He said that when you talk to people in Washington about Israel today, the people who are angry, who are disappointed, it's no longer just, occupation, settlements, it's directly the Netanyahu-Trump link. My observation specifically about the American Jewish community is that 3 years of the Trump presidency and of the Netanyahu-Trump bromance have done more harm to Israel standing in the American Jewish community than 50 years of occupation. Because
and not only among liberals?
Well, you talk about the American Jewish community, it's overwhelmingly a liberal majority. That could change in the future with the Orthodox gaining more power and just having more people. But the current day American Jewish community, I think many people who for years defended Israel when it came to the issues that we at Haaretz write about all the time, especially in the editorials, the occupation and the settlements, on those issues, really the consensus position in the American Jewish community for many decades was to defend Israel, and even liberal organizations still on these issues had an exception, if not to support the Israeli policy, to explain it, to understand it, to see it in a different light. It's complicated, right? This is the sentence you always hear. It's a complicated issue. And I think the Trump-Netanyahu cooperation broke that, because Trump is so toxic to the majority of the American Jewish community, and by the way, so beloved and so dear to the Jewish minority that supports him, especially in the Orthodox community. He's a rock star over there. But the majority of the American Jewish community, the more liberal denominations and the people who are not religiously active but identify as Jewish, Trump is so toxic to that population that seeing Netanyahu stand up time and again and support Trump, and seeing Ambassador Dermer once again and again and again compliment him, it caused more damage to how these people, these people view Israel than 50 years of occupation. Because for the occupation, you could have explanations. What we learned in Jewish day school, I would call it, that Israel is a small country surrounded by enemies in a very difficult position, and has security constraints, and the Arab side is also problematic. By the way, all of it I think is true. But when it came to the Netanyahu-Trump picture, people could not explain it. People, the liberal American Jews who don't like Trump, they just could not comprehend it. And that caused so much frustration and so much disappointment that it really is continuing until this very day. And if we will see Israel become involved in the upcoming election, especially on the Iran issue, it will get even worse.
And I think you were being gentle by saying that Israel was complimentary to Trump. This was flattery and groveling most of the time.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, they know what works. So, so we have less than 10 minutes, and we have some questions from the audience. So the first one is, how will Netanyahu's trial, which we didn't really discuss, affect the next political moves?
It remains to be seen. What we are seeing that the Haaretz, at least the Hebrew headline currently on the Haaretz news website, is about a struggle between Netanyahu's attorneys and the Attorney General. Will Netanyahu be forced to actually appear in court on Sunday, when the first day of his trial, of the indictment? So I think what we'll see is huge, enormous coverage. Of course, we faced a similar situation in the past, or a rather similar situation in the past, when Olmert was prime minister, but then he resigned and stood trial. But this is different. Netanyahu is a much larger persona in Israeli politics. And for years, I think that nobody could really imagine this day, that especially the fact that he's both on trial and remains a prime minister. That's a very, very different situation. So now we have two prime ministers, one of them the alternate, Gantz. We see Netanyahu leading one of the most complicated and difficult small states in the world in times of enormous trouble, some of this financial problems, the financial crisis because of the coronavirus. And suddenly he's facing a trial as well. How will this evolve? Will he be forced to be in court twice or three times a week? It's rather clear that he's trying to avoid that. How will his supporters react? How will he handle the government considering all this? Would he continue the attacks on the Minister of Justice, on the lawyers, the Attorney General, and so on? There's been a very massive campaign. Amir mentioned in the beginning what Gantz has went through. What the Attorney General is going through right now is quite ugly. There are similarities with the situation in Washington as well. This is an uncharted territory for everybody. I think this will control the headlines at least until annexation comes along. And if we get a rest from the virus, it doesn't mean that the news cycle would somehow slow down. This is going to be a huge political and a huge news story as of next Sunday.
Francis wants to know if the fact that annexation is clearly illegal under international law plays any role in the inner Israeli debate about this issue. How do Israelis see annexation?
There's some discussion of that, especially among left-wing politicians. But I think the tendency, unfortunately, from my perspective of Israelis for many, many years is to say, well, this is, there's a double standard in the international community. We need to do what's good for Israel, and we can avoid criticism from the UN, from the European Union, and so on. This is our business, and all this talk about human rights and so on, this is not for us. We're discussing security here. We're discussing Israel's historical or biblical right to these territories. This is the issue. So not much mention of that. Of course, the Haaretz editorials will mention that. Of course, some left-wing politicians, or what remained of the left-wing parties in the Knesset, would discuss that. But mainly it will be a discussion of what good would this do for Israel. And the warnings we will hear will be mostly focused on possible negative implications regarding our security situation more than anything else.
I will add on this front that I think the only place where you have concern a bit is the ICC, the International Criminal Court, because if that somehow becomes, if Israel gets tangled up in trouble over there, and I know I've written a lot about that front, that is more of a concern, but I agree with Amos that it's not on the top of the list. And I think the reason for this...
Netanyahu just said in his first speech as a fifth-time prime minister that the ICC is the fourth most pressing issue for the new government. I think the fourth, yeah.
So I mean, it is, and that's the only place where you will see this concern. And I advise everyone to keep reading what Noah is writing about it. And I think the other issue is the American approach, because if you have an American administration that comes and says international law is important and we expect American allies to respect international law because this is the basis for the American values a ruled world, and that's why it's so important, of course the Israeli approach would be completely different. And we had that in the past with American administrations that supported Israel to some degree, and gave a lot of military aid, etc. But on issues of international law, specifically around settlements, we're very clear that it will be embarrassing and problematic for America to support Israeli moves that are completely against international law at the same time that America is demanding other countries to uphold the international legal standards. That's not really the situation with the Trump administration. And I think that's one of the reasons why this issue is not getting a lot of discussion in Israel. Because when America comes and says, forget international law, who cares? Israel is not going to be holier than the Pope on this issue.
So it's been a lovely hour. Time flied, and I want to thank you for joining us, and everyone from all over the world. Amazing numbers. Thank you for being with us, and stay safe. And I hope we will see you soon in another webinar by Haaretz Live. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Bye.